UNICEF has lauded South Africa's progress in advancing children's rights. A report by the Committee on the Rights of the Child shows that country continues to lead by example through its commitment to the passing of institutional and policy measures related to the realisation of child rights. To discuss this issue, I'm now joined by Chief of Communications and Partnerships at UNICEF South Africa, Toby Fricker. Toby, appreciate your time this morning. Let's start off with how effectively South Africa has been in implementing the policies and measures mentioned in advancing child rights.
Yeah, well, I think as the report, the concluding observations from the Committee on the Rights of the Child said, South Africa has put in place a number of key policies, key acts to support child rights in South Africa, and we've seen that since 1995, let's say, when South Africa, the first treaty they signed was the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So that's absolutely critical. It's top level stuff, putting in place that policy. But as we all know, and as we work towards putting that policy into action, that's the absolutely critical part as well. But what we've seen is things like the sign language, for example, as the 12th official language in South Africa. It's inclusivity. It's bringing children in to education, improving access to education for children with learning disabilities as well. We've seen a number of measures that have helped to do that, but also in other areas as well. And that's why we welcome that, but we also take away the observations from the Child Rights Committee on a number of areas where we really need to put in place action urgently, particularly on issues like violence, malnutrition, etc.
Well, Toby, it's pretty exciting that these laws and acts have been implemented since 1994, as you state. But the issue, I suppose, that we need to discuss is implementation versus the announcement or pronouncement of an actual law. I mean, if we look at the statistics around young girls as young as 10 falling pregnant, I mean, what does that speak to when you draw parallels between laws that have been realised or if enacted and actual implementation of the same? Yeah,
you're right. I mean, what this report does is it basically tries to paint a picture of the situation of child rights in the country today. But what we really have to look at is what is the reality on the ground, and that's what you're talking to. Mm-hmm. So what is the reality for a learner going through the education system? What is the reality for the children who are affected by violence? And we're seeing these horrific levels of violence that continue through the reporting that the police department does. And it's really, how can we now take action to really bring those levels of violence down, improve the learning journey for every child, and create an environment that is more conducive to childhood, let's say. And that really, it starts at the home, but it's a holistic approach. And that's what's important about this report. It provides recommendations. It provides the observations that allow UNICEF, allow government, allow civil society and many other partners to put in place and to work towards improving the situation for every child across the country.
So can we draw parallels to what's happening in other developing nations around similar issues? Where are other countries versus where South Africa is?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I think it's always difficult to draw direct parallels, let's say. I mean, different countries report to the Committee on the Rights of the Child at different times. In South Africa, they've just provided that report recently, and it provides also constructive dialogue between the government, between UN, civil society, academia, and then the private sector and others. So it's hard to draw those parallels. But what I would say is we see the progress. We've seen progress with, for example, under 5 child mortality has reduced significantly over the last 2 decades. We've seen birth registration rates rise. We've seen maternal mortality go down as well. So there has been progress, but we are, to avoid a cliche, but we are at a critical crossroads, let's say, where we need to push ahead. We're in a critical election year. We need to really push for children, putting children at the centre of priorities. And that's what the report also states, that children should be a national priority. After all, they are the future. We need to build the support for children from the home to the community.
So how is South Africa addressing issues related to sexual and reproductive health, right? Particularly for adolescent girls? And I think this is particularly topical. I mean, every quarter, the South African Police Service reports on the numbers around gender-based violence, and many of those victims are children or young girls. I mean, the numbers are horrendous.
Yeah, I mean, the numbers are horrendous. In fact, yesterday, UNICEF was with partners in Nelson Mandela Bay holding a dialogue actually with children and adolescents and young people about what are the issues, what are the issues that they're facing in terms of accessing sexual reproductive health services. And we're still seeing children feeling like they're not prioritized, feeling like when they try to access services, they're told, it's not their time, it's not right for them. So there are key issues that we're seeing it within community level. And it's really about understanding on the ground what are the blockages, what are the challenges, and how do we overcome that. So we are working with the Canadian government, for example, who are providing some funding to UNICEF, to UNFPA as well, to try and then improve those services on the ground at a community level, which is really where we need to act urgently now.
A bit of a contradiction here, Toby, is the issues around implementing plans to reduce the child hunger, and then on the other end, address issues around obesity.
No, you're absolutely right, and we see what's called sort of the triple burden of malnutrition. And we see the youngest children who are exposed to issues of child hunger, particularly in certain pockets of the country, pockets like in the Eastern Cape. And then at the same time, we have this rising level of adolescent obesity, which is another challenge. And it's about, one is about education, one is about the food systems. How can we improve and make sure we support subsistence agriculture, for example? How can we support communities with community food gardens? But at the same time, how do we work with private sector, with the corporates who are marketing foodstuffs for adolescents? It's easy to access cheap food, which is unhealthy. So we've been running campaigns with adolescents, with young people themselves to work on those issues. But you're right, it is two very complicated issues, different issues, but complicated. And both of them impact on children immediately. We have child hunger, but we also have adolescent obesity, which in turn can lead to non-communicable diseases further down the line and have a massive impact on the healthcare system more broadly.
So, Toby, we have all these conversations, multiple conversations occurring on various platforms. You're doing a lot of work with government, with corporate South Africa. Let's talk about the citizenry. Right now, it's one thing to implement a law that allows or protects the rights of children. It obviously allows then for the law to take its case, to take its course rather, in the event that any of these laws are abused. But what about the advocacy that is required to stop the practices from happening so that the laws do not have to be enacted, if you will, or implemented? Right? So let's talk about the conversations that are happening on the ground with citizens of South Africa that speaks to do not abuse young children, children cannot get married before a certain age, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the positives, let's say, is that advocacy is happening. I mean, there's a lot of engagements with young people on the ground with children. Like I said, yesterday we were just in Nelson Mandela Bay. We're working with a sort of cohort of adolescents on the obesity issues that we've been talking about earlier. And also critically is parenting. So the report, actually, the concluding observations also mentioned the importance of parenting support. And that's not about putting a burden on parents or caregivers, but it's about saying how can we better support parents and caregivers, particularly at early childhood development level, because that sets the foundation for life, for a child for life. If they can get a nurturing care, positive environment, positive discipline at a very early years, that is where we can really help to break the cycle of violence, for example. That's where we can set the foundation for a child to learn, to keep learning through the whole educational journey and move into their working lives. So it's about providing that support at a community level, working with multiple partners, but also getting the commitment from a budgeting perspective to be able to provide support to local organisations who are there on the ground with parents, with communities, who know the context, who know the nuances, the issues that affect children and parents, and can really help to strengthen that overall care.
Two issues, Toby, that I'm hoping you'll be able to give us some insights on. One of those issues is that the best place to teach children about their rights, because children primarily are the majority of the whistleblowers on the issues, but they have to know that whatever's happening to them is wrong, or that they're entitled to certain provisions. And the school structure allows us that because it potentially has the greatest reach if you want to reach young people. Do we have enough that's happening within the structure? And are the kids themselves who are protected by these laws fully aware of what their rights are? Because in many cases, if you don't know that it is a right, you're not going to push for it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the first thing is information, and raising awareness of what are your rights, what are your rights as a child. And actually the report also says that we need to work on a child-friendly version of those observations and get those out to schools, get those out to children, so they see what are the observations of the current situation of child rights in South Africa, and then children can better understand that themselves, because they are they're the rights holders that we need to then react to. We have had, for example, we produced a climate landscape analysis for children, about children, the situation for children in South Africa, and we see in there also those references to making sure that children are involved. There are specific references to children and the issues that are impacting them in the climate space, let's say, and how do we then bring children and young people into tackling those. We've seen what we've been doing is working with what are called so-called citizen scientists, and those are young people who are actually doing water monitoring, water pollution monitoring at a school level, but also in the community, and reporting that back through the system. So it's actually bringing children, bringing young people into those discussions, but bringing them into action as well, to be able to report back, to monitor on things like the Sustainable Development Goals. And there's always more work we can do in that. We are working with the Department of Basic Education. We have a number of initiatives in schools like the Girls and Boys Education Movement, which does a lot of work on life skills. It does a lot of work on trying to really socialise child rights, let's say, among children and learners. And that work goes on, but it is absolutely critical that children understand what are their specific rights.
So much of the work that you're doing speaks to going into structured areas. I'd like to bring in informal settlements, which are not nearly as structured as we'd like, but also are home to hundreds of thousands of children across South Africa. Has there been a concerted effort to get into those specific areas?
Yeah, I mean, informal settlements, like you said, have thousands of children, and these are the most vulnerable children, let's say, often across the country. We've been doing a lot of work to try and strengthen access to education for children in informal settlements, to try and support in terms of, for example, in KwaZulu-Natal, where we saw flooding always affects informal settlements the most. And it's how do then we work with those communities as well through civil society, so UNICEF working with civil society, but many others as well, who are doing amazing work to try and improve, let's say, the living conditions of families in those communities, and particularly taking into account then the situation for children. So it's about every child. I mean, the concluding observations of the report again, are looking at children across the country, every child. Inclusivity is absolutely vital. Inclusivity in terms of the education system, in terms of birth registration, having the documentation you need, is vital across the board, wherever any child lives.
And finally, Toby, before we let you go, where do you sort of find the greatest challenges in doing some of the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing, what is critical is to reach that scale. And I think you've spoken about it today, where we see children in so many different contexts, but children who are affected in many ways by the same thing, but in different ways. It's absolutely critical that we find that scale to reach every child who is in need. And to do that, we also need that support from a resources perspective. That means financial, it also means technical support as well, to be able to provide the best service possible we can for every child, to help them survive and thrive, as we say.
Toby, absolutely great speaking to you this morning. Chief of Communications and Partnerships at UNICEF South Africa, Toby Fricker.